Hey there, so today I'm going to be talking about how to be better at World of Warcraft. This video is split into 25 points which do span a whole bunch of topics, so if a topic isn't interesting to you, then you can of course skip ahead to the next one. I will be starting off with some pretty basic stuff, but you can jump around and see what you like. Now, overall, this is aimed at basically everyone who is interested in PvE, but is not a Mythic raider. Let's be honest, if you're raiding Mythics, you kind of do all these things anyway. So without further waffle, let's jump right into point number 1. First of all, we've got class guides and class-specific tips and tricks. Now, this is probably something that most of you do already, but it's worth saying that knowing your class is, of course, absolutely essential. You can find guides in many different places, but I personally recommend Icy Vein's written guides and Preach's class guides, which are in video form. There are also guides on Wowhead and multiple other sites. Most classes also have got great guides floating around on the MMO Champion forums. And if you've just been cruising along for the last while, not really paying attention to your spec, especially with Warlords of Draenor changes, then chances are you're doing something that's far from optimal and you need to have a bit of a refresh of how you play your character. Being suboptimal in solo play is fine, but it's really irresponsible and selfish if you're in group content. If you're willfully suboptimal, then you're just doing things at the expense of other people. Now, speaking of the MMO Champion forums, and forums in general, such as the Icy Veins ones, there are often excellent tips and tricks threads located there on the specific class forums. Many of your class's more niche abilities can be cleverly used to minimize or even completely skip boss mechanics, which is extremely useful. Next, it's very important to analyze your character's stats. The easiest way to do this, honestly, is just to plug it into Ask Mr. Robot. That site will give you optimized gems, enchants, it'll show your best in slot gear, and various other handy things. There is also a paid subscription which gives you access to some additional features if you're into that. You can also use some add-ons like Pawn to see if gear is an upgrade or not, based on stat weights that you put into the add-on. In case you're not aware what stat weights are, it's just a measure of how good stats are in comparison to other stats for your spec. Most class guides will include stat weights. Next, it's very important that you think about gearing, and this does sort of follow off my last point, but learning what items come from what boss, and then being able to also understand itemization is extremely important. The state of itemization has really changed in Warlords of Draenor. Secondary stats are highly important, and without reforging, it's hard, well, basically impossible, to make a bad piece good, and you sort of could do that in the past expansion. So, make a list of the bosses that drop well-itemized gear for your spec, and try to get that stuff. Using the Ask Mr. Robot character analyzer or an add-on like Pawn, of course, is really helpful when doing this. Try to get the tier pieces, which have got really good secondary stats for your spec, and then fill out your other slots with decently statted offset bits of gear. Also, if you can afford crafted gear, it's actually quite a good way to patch up any holes in your overall gear. Since you can re-roll the stats of crafted gear, you can essentially get it to the point where they are perfectly itemized, which makes it a really attractive option. Also, bear in mind that crafted gear goes up to item level 680 in patch 6.1. Finally, item level does mean a whole lot less in Warlords of Draenor due to the way that stats have played out, the way that things are going with reforging, and then also being able to proc additional gem sockets. Being able to compare gear with things like Pawn and Ask Mr. Robot is going to be really helpful, and will hopefully ensure that you don't waste your EPGP or something like that on a bit of gear that's actually kind of crap. Alright, so for this next point, let's move away from gear and talk about logs. Now, if you don't know what logs are, essentially it's just all of the data and information of your raids can be uploaded to websites which will then parse through it and show you lots of very interesting information. Looking at your raid logs is essentially something that you should do if you are really serious about improving as a raider. Warcraft logs is a fantastic choice that offers a lot of detailed information, though it will take some work to fully be able to understand it and trawl through the sheer amount of stuff that you're presented with. Ask Mr. Robot recently launched a feature which allows you to essentially turn your log data into interactive infographics. This stuff is really just easily presented and it's very easy to digest, so if you want a quick summary of key areas that both you as an individual or your raid as a whole could improve, then looking into these options is really good. Remember, no lazy raiders are safe from the logs, so don't get caught out by them. And finally, on the topic of pre-raid preparation, we have got researching boss fights. Now, I'm sure the vast majority of you are good raiders who do this, but I know that some people don't. There's always that person in every raid who just does, you know they don't, because they screw up all the time. Don't be that person. There are lots of excellent encounter guides spread throughout the internet, both in written and video form. These places include Icy Veins, Wowhead, LOS Gaming, Fat Boss, Method, and loads more. If you show up to a raid without knowing the fights, essentially you're just being a bit of a selfish ass because you're expecting other people to cover for your mistakes and do the work for you. And it really doesn't take that long to learn a fight. There really is no excuse. If you don't have time to learn the fight on the day of the raid, then learn it the day before. And guess what? If your memory isn't sufficient to do that, then you got memory problems. Look into that. But essentially, learn your boss fights. It will make you an asset to your raid. Alright, with that stuff covered, it's time to move on to the next series of points, which are mainly going to be about your computer setup. And first of all, let's talk about keyboards. I recommend using a mechanical keyboard. Essentially, they are more comfortable. Also, mechanical key switches, depending on the specific kind of key switch, are actually quite a bit more tactile. There are many different switches on the market, and I recommend checking out Tech Syndicate's key switch comparison video. That's a bit of a mouthful. I find that the key switches actually just give you better tactile feedback, which I think just gives you more like sensory information and stuff to just play your rotation better, I suppose. It's not like getting a keyboard is going to double your DPS or anything insane like that, but I think that if you're generally more comfortable playing, then I think you're just more freed up to perform better. Now, in case you're not aware what a mechanical keyboard is, essentially, instead of using a sort of rubber dome membrane, which is what most keyboards use, they use a specific little switch underneath every key. Rubber dome keyboards generally feel a little bit more cheap and mushy, and there's just less tactile feedback there, which isn't really a good thing. Now, while a shiny mechanical keyboard is great, they're kind of expensive, and if you are going to throw your money at something, I would recommend throwing it at perhaps a mouse. Now, the next point is, of course, about mice. While a keyboard won't be a crazy increase in DPS, something like a mouse could actually help you a lot. Personally, I've used a Razer Naga since early Wrath of the Lich King, and I just simply would not go back. I find it to be far more responsive and far more comfortable to play. Instead of having my keybinds spread all over my keyboard, where I'm basically doing sort of finger gymnastics to reach them all, I just have them all nicely clustered on my keypad. They're accessed via my thumb, and essentially hardly any movement is required. After some practice, it becomes absolute second nature, and I find that it's just been really good for my response times. There are other mice on the market which do similar things, but the only one that I can personally vouch for is the Razer Naga, especially the 2014 onwards model, as they have got mechanical buttons on the keypad, which are also just a little bit more defined, and they're a large improvement over the original design. Now, if getting a Naga or something like that isn't your thing, then it's still worth getting a good mouse with a few extra buttons, as they can be quite useful for your keybinds. Finally, it is worth saying that with mouse and keyboards, a lot of it does come down to what makes you personally feel comfortable. If you've got a comfortable setup that really just fits how you play and you just click with, then you'll be more comfortable and you'll be able to play better. For me, that does involve a mechanical keyboard and a very, very good MMO gaming mouse. But for you, the requirements might be a bit different. Ultimately, it comes down to personal choice, and before doing anything hasty, do try to find a friend to maybe use their setup and see what it's like. Next, let's have a bit of a talk about movement. So I think most people just use WAS and D to move, and you know what, for most cases when you're just chilling out, that's fine. But if you are in an intense raid, or perhaps doing some PvP, then having a better way of moving is absolutely going to be extremely helpful. Mainly in PvP, I just can't overstate how important it is to properly mouse turn in PvP. So, as much as possible, the way you want to do your moving is to turn by holding in the right mouse button and then moving your mouse. You can also then use Q and E to strafe. Also, walking backwards is really suboptimal. So instead, what you want to do is turn a little bit with your mouse and then strafe. That is just a much quicker way of running backwards, essentially. Of course, though, if you're in no real need of extreme speed, then, you know what, backtracking can be sort of okay for a second. It's not going to murder you, unless you're trying to backtrack out of the fire. Don't do that. Run out of the fire. Now also, mainly, just use W, Q, E, and then the right mouse to move. That's overall the best way to do it. And rather than me blabbing on here, if you don't do this, just hop in game, use WQE in your mouse, and get used to it. Easiest way to do it, and it will help you out in stressful situations. With movement covered, it's time to talk about key bindings. So first of all, keybind your abilities rather than being a clicker. Clicking is completely suboptimal, it will make your life harder, and you will be a worse player for it. Moving on from being a clicker though can be a little bit awkward, so I completely empathize there, because you won't have developed the muscle memory, which means that initially it might seem, a little bit tricky, but stick with it, you'll develop that muscle memory, and over time it will be better. One of the biggest drawbacks about clicking is that moving well actually does require the use of your mouse, so if you're clicking in abilities, it sort of precludes actually moving well. Now that all that stuff is covered, let's talk about actually how to bind your keys. So first of all, every setup is different and it's about what is comfortable for you. When you are binding keys, focus on the easy to press buttons. So 1 through 5 are really good keys as they are quite close to where your fingers in your left hand will be, if you're right-handed, and then also you can bind various keys that are in and around WASD to your various abilities. If you have any extra mouse buttons, be sure to use them. Your reaction time will be extremely fast as next to no finger movement will be required, assuming you've got a decently designed mouse. I have a Naga, so all of my main abilities are there, but even if you only have a few extra buttons on your mouse, it's still a great place to put some of your high priority abilities. Alright then, so we've got lots of the setup stuff covered. Let's start to talk about the actual gameplay and the stuff you'll be doing in-game. And first, I just want to say that playing other classes is an extremely beneficial thing. Whether you are doing PvP or PvE, knowing the toolkit of the other classes in the game will be very beneficial. Understanding how they play will give you insight into what other classes are good at or bad at, and more importantly, what the other people in your raid team are actually doing. I feel that this does increase your play, and also, a little bit of empathy and understanding what other people are dealing with does sort of go a long way. Also, it's a great way to just increase your general knowledge of the game. The more that you know, then the more that you'll understand, and if you understand World of Warcraft from a sort of base mechanical level extremely well, then you will be able to better perform in a team, and that is very important. Now, of course, if you're a PvPer, then all of these points go doubly so. Knowing the exact toolkit of every other class that you could come up against is just absolutely vital. You need to know when to do a hard CC, you need to know what to interrupt, and all those other things. I'm not really a main PvPer, but that's just the case for PvP. Next, let's talk about communication. So, being able to communicate is just so important. First of all, you need to have the right voice over IP program. Basically just a chat application. Now this does vary from guild to guild, but I can say that after moving to Mumble, I would not look back. The quality is far better than what our team got with Ventrilo, and I've also heard great things about the newest version of TeamSpeak. Now, if you are raiding, then don't be afraid to ask questions. As much as you might think a dumb question might be embarrassing, there is nothing in comparison to just getting everyone killed. That is the ultimate suckage, you don't want it. Now also, do try to discuss raid strategy, and don't be afraid to speak, but equally don't interrupt people, especially when the raid leader is going over the overall plan for the fight. That's kind of their, 2 or 3 minutes in the limelight where they need to be listened to. Now during fights, cut the chatter and focus. No waffle, no talking about how your day at work is, you're fighting. Any speaking should be a part of the team's plan for the encounter. Someone, usually the raid leader or, a main assist or something like that, will be calling out stuff when necessary. And if you are part of a sub-team, then, that's dealing with a mechanic, for example, the Brand and Margok, then do call out stuff when it's needed, because a little bit of communication can go a very long way, especially if you are dealing with a core mechanic. Now, during the fight, communication should be very clear and very concise, with absolutely no bullshit and no waffle. Also, use headphones instead of speakers, and do try to have a decent quality microphone. And now also, as I said, I don't have much PvP experience, but from what I've seen on the internet anyway, from watching gameplay videos, people usually call out when they are going to CC, when they have been CC'd, when they are about to burst, if they're being burst, and in general just communicate strategy as to the other players in the arena and what's going on. Alright, so let's talk about actual core gameplay things. First of all, you want to interrupt as much as is humanly possible. It's going to make you look really good. Also, dispel and decurse, if your class can do that. It doesn't take that much effort on your part, and it makes everything else far easier and far safer. You should use an add-on like Quartz to make really prominent enemy cast bars so that you are quickly alerted to casts. Personally, I've got it so that enemy cast bars appear right above my own, and while it could be a bit more prominent, I think it just does work for me. Now also, what you want to do is read the dungeon journal. Some of the Warlords of Draenor content have loads of interruptible spells that are essentially just red herrings, so ensure that you know what to interrupt, and essentially just interrupt as much as is humanly possible. Remember, things like recount and all that will track interrupts, and your raid leader will be looking at it. So you want to look good, right? Therefore, interrupt shit as much as possible. It'll make you awesome. Another thing that you should really be paying attention to is crowd control. This is less important these days than it was in the past, but just proactively CC as much as you can. It's still a very excellent skill to have, and you'll have a much smoother time raiding if the annoying trash is CC'd and dealt with. More so if you are raiding at the lower gear levels, where the odd bit of trash can be a bit of a pain. Also, CC skills can sometimes be useful in a fight. For example, as a hunter, I often use Binding Shot and Ice Trap in Korak against the various adds that come. Essentially, being seen to do CC makes you look like someone who's in general got their head screwed on, and essentially, you just look good in front of the rest of the raid, which is really good if you're in the sort of guild where you need to work to secure your raid position. Another very important thing is to not only track your DPS, but also look at damage taken. A good DPS player will know how to cause as little stress on the healers as is possible. This will lead to more success as, well, the healers will be happy, the tanks will hopefully then be a bit more alive in general, and of course, it will make you look good. Here's the thing, good raid leaders are looking at all of the metrics that they can, including damage taken. If you are the DPS player with twice the damage taken of everyone else, because you're always in the fire or getting hit by things, then you're not going to look good. And that's obviously not a very good thing. In fact, I would nearly argue that as long as someone has got good enough DPS, what's more important is low damage taken, lots of CCs when needed, lots of interrupts, and in general, just very good knowledge of fight mechanics. A dead player who gets other people killed but does good DPS when they're alive is not really an asset to a raid. Another extremely important thing, and this is really just more of a mindset, is to plan ahead all the time. Your head should always be a few steps ahead of where you currently are. I've really said head a lot in that last sentence, but anyway, expert knowledge of your class and the encounter in question is going to be key when doing this stuff right. For an example, many encounters will apply debuffs randomly out to players. You always need to have in the back of your mind, what do I do if this debuff goes on me? For example, in Tectus, if you get Earthen Barrage, always know what your plan is. And this also goes in terms of how your class is playing. Try to think at least a few abilities ahead, and in general, just have yourself be clued into your rotation. If you see that perhaps your most powerful spell comes off cooldown in 6 seconds, try to think what you can squeeze in before that comes off, and just in general, lots of planning and just have extremely good awareness of both the encounter and of course your own class. Next, a very important thing that I think in these days of lots of add-ons and tracking and things like that is to just prioritize fight mechanics over DPS. This one is stupidly important, seriously, you do absolutely no damage if you are dead, and even if you don't get yourself killed and only injure yourself, well, you're likely going to put the healers under undue stress, which could lead to other people dying. If you know the mechanics perfectly, then you are safe to focus on increasing your damage, so just try to get the mechanics as good as you can, and you know what, the DPS will probably come naturally after that. Now of course, if you are rock bottom in the raid's DPS chart all the time, then you do need to take further steps outside of the raid to improve because you're just holding the other people back. Another thing that you should bear in mind is to choose the right spec, talents, and glyphs for the fight that you're going to be doing. Often the performance of the specs do vary wildly between fight to fight, and of course with varying gear levels. Generally, some specs will favour an AoE fight, and some specs will favour a single target fight. Knowing what the right tool to use means more damage, more healing, less damage taken, and overall, just better performance. Most class forums, for example, say the ones in MMO Champion, will have excellent discussion threads and recommended builds and specs for every single boss. Generally following them will steer you right and will allow you to perform better on a boss-by-boss basis. Another excellent thing that you should do, if possible, is to take on responsibility within a fight. If it suits your class, then do try to take on these additional rules of responsibility. This especially applies if you're a hunter, and I am a hunter. Hunters are the most mobile class in the game, and due to the likes of Deterrence and Disengage, you are extremely well suited to doing those extra roles. It will cost you less than it will cost someone else to do the same work, so if you are a hunter, you should be the one doing these jobs. Anyway, back on point. If you are seen to be the person who's always trying to go the extra mile and do those extra things, then you're going to have a far more secure raid spot and you'll be better respected. People will think, oh, well, that's the person who's doing all this cool shit which makes my life easier. People will like you, that's a good thing. You'll also be, I think, more elevated to being one of the core members of the raid team because you're always the person that the raid leader goes to when they need someone to deal with a mechanic. It's better to be that person than just another one of those interchangeable DPSers. However, this is less of an important point now that raid systems are flexible, but still, do take on responsibility, and if you can deal with it well, it'll make you a really, really good player. Also, if you don't challenge yourself, it's going to be hard to get better, and this is a great way of challenging yourself. And finally, as far as gameplay goes, the training dummy is your friend. This can be eye-bleedingly boring, and it can just be essential though in some cases. If you're having problems with your damage or whatever in a raid, then do go to the training dummies. Find a class guide, learn the priority of your abilities, and then just sit at that dummy for as long as it takes to get it as close to perfect as you can. Now, of course, executing your class well in a dummy is far easier than doing it when you've got boss mechanics to deal with, but even just in terms of getting the muscle memory there and getting solid basics, it's extremely important. Also, by the way, if you are moving from being a clicker to a keybinder, the target dummy is really your friend because you just need to put the time in to build up that muscle memory. Okay, that's really most of the gameplay stuff covered, and I'm just going to quickly talk about graphical settings for this next point. Now, as far as I'm concerned, you need to be running this game at a decently high frame rate if you're going to be able to play comfortably and react to things decently. Seriously, I've heard of raiders playing at 10 frames per second on a laptop. That is absurd. Turn your graphics options down when you're in raids if you're not getting close to 60 frames per second. And if you're stuck on a weak laptop or perhaps are looking to upgrade, then do consider building a desktop PC. It's a great option and it really isn't that expensive at all. For $400 to $600 you can get an excellent PC that can tackle all the modern games. I recommend checking out Tech Syndicate's PC building guide if you want to learn how to build a computer, and as far as components go, well, those of you who are already interested in hardware will kind of know what the crack is there, but if you're completely new, then MMO Champion does a build guide of the month post, and many YouTube channels like Tech Syndicate and Linus Tech Tips do great build guides and suggestions from time to time. Playing the game at 24 frames per second does not make it more cinematic, it just makes you more likely to be dead. Finally, in the next few points, I'm going to talk about add-ons, because add-ons really are important. First of all, Bigwigs/DBM. Now, having one of these is basically essential. It will give you all the information that you need to know to not die in the fight, mainly timers and warnings for various important abilities. You can also jump into its settings and move the various timers and things like that around so that they fit in your UI. And also, if you find yourself dying to a particular mechanic, you can actually tweak the add-on settings so that it emphasizes the warning for that mechanic even more, making it pretty much impossible to miss unless you're literally a potato, and I don't recommend being a potato. The next add-on on the list is Recount/SCADA. Something like this is pretty much needed. If you're a DPS, then I think as long as you're dealing with the fight mechanics well, I'd say treat DPS like a competition. And, of course, don't have your eyes glued to Recount or whatever throughout the fight. That's dumb. Only really bother about this stuff at the end of the fight. But healthy competition encourages everyone to try to be better. And, honestly, if you do more DPS, the fight is shorter, which means that there's even less time for people to fail in mechanics and get you all killed. Now, of course, damage is not everything. These add-ons track loads of other things, including interrupts and damage taken. When possible, try to be the best at every metric. Now, of course, gaming the numbers is not proof that you're the best raider in the planet, but in general, try to be high damage, low damage taken, and with lots of interrupts. Or if you're a healer, you know, high healing, low damage taken, etc. Another add-on that I really recommend is Tidy Panels. This is a fantastic add-on for getting better enemy panels. You can also configure them so that things like debuffs are displayed, which is also really handy. Now, I actually switched the theme to one that I find to be a bit more clear, and that's very easily clickable. I think a lot of UI design is about getting a setup, which means that you can easily digest all the information that's thrown at you, and for me, tidy panels is a really important part of that. Another add-on that will really help you play your class is Tell Me When /Weak Ores /Power Ores. Now these are all really powerful add-ons, with Tell Me When perhaps being the most simple to set up, and then Weak Ores /Power Ores being a bit more advanced, but I think a bit more capable as well. Now these add-ons essentially are used to track cooldowns for important abilities. You can also use them to track, say, the energy bar for your character, you can track buffs, trinket procs, and many other things. There isn't time to include a guide to them within this video, but just do a YouTube search for the guide. There are plenty of them out there, and there's lots of information. Basically, getting these set up right means that you should never miss an ability, never miss a cooldown, and you'll just have all the information that you need for your actual class pretty much at your fingertips. And finally, I'm just going to go over some more miscellaneous things in terms of add-ons. The ones that I listed a few minutes ago are kind of the core add-ons that I think every player should have, at least from my perspective as a DPS player. Healers should look into the likes of Click and Grid, which from what I hear are both great add-ons. I also recommend using an action bar add-on like Bartender or Dominoes. Also, GTFO is a great add-on for just not, getting big warnings in case you're standing in the fire. So if you keep on standing in the fire, GTFO, download that add-on. Also, good raid frames are a must. I personally use shadowed unit frames, but there are many other options out there. The add-on setup that I personally use is one that I custom made, and you can see my video on that in the description of this video. It's designed to be a little bit more minimalist, and a lot of things do sort of fade in combat, so while it might look completely barren out of combat, it does give me all the information that I need to do DPS as a hunter. And really, that's pretty much it. I think what I want to close this video off is just a little bit of a talk about the general mindset that I think is just most conducive to being good. Never think your play is perfect, always be open to criticism, and always try to improve, if that's what you want to do. You often get, assholes with an attitude who think they're just the dog's bollocks, when in fact, they're pretty darn average, and those people are often kind of toxic. Always just try to go in with a mindset that's focused on learning, getting better, and then just fostering a sort of constructive environment. Basically, just win by being awesome, that's a good thing to do, and focus on being better rather than blaming others. We see so much in online games, especially MOBAs actually, people being toxic assholes, not being okay with criticism and thinking that they're just the true greatness. When, in fact, if everyone would just sit back, try to be constructive, try to improve as an individual, I think overall we would have a better landscape that's full of players who are just better. So essentially just be a complete ball and badass and do all the deeps, do all the heals, tank all the things, and be awesome. And really that is pretty much it for the video. So if you've got any tips of your own, please be sure to leave them down in the comments of the video, especially if you are a main healer, a tank, or perhaps someone who's really involved in the PvP scene. It would be really cool to see what you guys have got to offer. Anyway, that's it for the video, so thank you very much for watching, and if you're new, do check out the channel, there might be some other stuff that you like. I do daily World of Warcraft content. Anyway, that's it for me, and I'll see you next time.